quarter, we're talking about David and Solomon, and we are now in the middle of Solomon, talking about some lessons from him. Last week, we talked about the temple and about the construction of the temple and what all that involved. One of the things I mentioned last week that I got a good recommendation from Brother Rick Smith last week is how does the temple compare size-wise? I don't know if all of you heard that or not. So last week we talked about the construction of the temple. So I did a little bit of very rough measurements this morning, and I put flags down kind of the area that the temple would have fit into. So it would have fit into our auditorium. So it was, by comparison to other temples at the time, pretty small, but it was extremely elaborate. So it was 30 feet wide, and I didn't have enough. Look at the flags. I have flags on going down the aisles. Didn't have enough flags or feet in the front to be 30 feet across. But you could consider the Holy of Holies on this end being 30 by 30. So starting at that wall, going to this pew is very roughly 30 by 30 on this side. Going down this way, another flag there where Brother Johnny is sitting. And then going back almost to the back wall, the remaining area there that's measured out was the holy place, where all some of the furniture was, the showbread tables, the candlesticks, altar of incense. So you can get an idea from here almost to the back wall is that measurement. Now, those are the two rooms. There was another 15 feet on that end for some people call it a vestibule, but it's an entryway where the people would enter or the priest would enter. So even beyond our auditorium, another 15 feet was roughly the measurement of the floor of the temple. And on the height, the ceilings in here are about 27 feet tall. The temple height was 45 feet tall, so another 18 feet beyond what we see here is our ceiling. So that gives you roughly the dimensions of the temple on the inside. And we talked about last week on the outside how there was additional construction going around the outside. But just to give you some perspective of how big the temple was we're looking at. And remind you that this area that was built for the temple was purchased by David. This was Mount Moriah, right outside what was then city of David, or Jerusalem. It has since been just enveloped by Jerusalem. But on this Mount Moriah, on the very top, was where Abraham had sacrificed Isaac, or was tested with Isaac's sacrifice. And that's the point where the temple was built. And then adjacent to that was Solomon's palace that he built as well as a part of that construction. So I'll leave that up here for just a second. We talked about how ornate it was, how David had started gathering materials during his reign, all the gold, the silver, some of the timber, some of the ironworks, some of the bronze that he started gathering that was ultimately going to go into the temple. But the thing we're going to talk about today is the Ark of the Covenant. This is an artist rendition. It is not actually what it looked like, just is somebody that had thought, well, what did the Ark of the Covenant look like? Some of the little, in this particular slide, diagrams up in the corners. Initially, the Ark of the Covenant housed not only the Ten Commandments, but a bowl of manna and Aaron's budding rod. So that's what those little things are up in the corners. But this kind of gives you an idea of what the ark maybe looked like, or at least an artist rendition. So it was built after the Israelites escaped Egypt. There were some specific instructions regarding the design of the Ark of the Covenant, and we see that in Exodus chapter 25. So if anybody's interested in seeing that, I'll read that on how the ark was to be constructed, starting in verse 10, Exodus 25:10. They shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, 1 cubit and a half its breadth, and 1 cubit and a half its height. You shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and outside shall you overlay it. And you shall make it and you shall make on it a molding of gold around it. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it and put them on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the one side of it and 2 rings on the other side of it. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. And you shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and 1 cubit and a half its breadth. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of hammered work shall you make them on the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub on the one end, and 1 cherub on the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat shall you make the cherubim on its 2 ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. And you shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. So just as a summary, when they made this according to God's instructions, it was made from acacia wood. It was covered in pure gold inside and out. They had the rings of gold on the sides through which the poles were inserted and to be able to carry it. And the mercy seat was created and placed on the ark between the cherubim located on each end. So when the Lord had instructed how to build it, he said in verse 22, and there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel. So the children of Israel, once they escaped Egypt, they were coming toward Canaan from Egypt. We read in Numbers that the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord went before them. So it was at the front of the procession of all the children of Israel as they were traveling toward Canaan. So it really served as a visual reminder of God's presence with his people. For a time, the ark was kept in the tabernacle at Shiloh, and once the Israelites, I'm sorry that's not very big on, I don't know if you can see that or not, but once they entered the promised land, it was kept for a time at Shiloh, you can see, and but the Israelites were not content with leaving it there at Shiloh. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 4, some years later, and this was roughly 1024 BC, time-wise, the Philistines at that time launch a major attack against the Israelites. And the Israelites set up camp at Ebenezer. And you can see at the very top of this map, Ebenezer marked where that was. And the Philistines were camped at Aphek, which is right above it. So the two armies were camped in that area. So believing that the Ark of the Covenant itself provided some advantage over the enemies, in chapter 4, verse 4, 1 Samuel, we read, the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. So they sent for the ark, brought the ark then to Ebenezer to help them in battle. And despite this initial boost in morale that this gave the army and the people, that, okay, we have the ark now and we're going to be successful because we have the ark, it did not save them from the Philistines, and they were captured. So we find that it was God's will, it was not God's will that they do this. So in just continuing to travel and trace where the ark went from there, the ark was captured. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, the ark we read is taken by the Philistines to Ashdod, to their city, which is on the far left there, near the coast. And they install it and put it in the temple of their god Dagon. And I won't read that story, but it's an interesting story to read. When they put it in the temple of Dagon, their image of Dagon fell on its face and could not stand before the Ark of the Covenant. Also, the people found out that this was not according to God's will because they were covered with tumors. We have just awful plague on the people, on the Philistines that had the ark. So some places had tumors. We see some places mention it as hemorrhoids. Regardless, it's miserable. So they had this miserable plague on them. Trying to make a change, get rid of or some kind of change with the ark, they then sent the ark of the covenant. It was moved through the Gaza area, went to Gath, and then eventually up to Ekron. So they moved the ark there, and we read then in 1 Samuel chapter 4 that they not only took the ark to Ekron, but they also took other items that they captured from the tabernacle. They took the portable four-horned altars, the bronze ceremonial washing stand, and some other things that they took from the tabernacle seemed to all come into Ekron. And they continue to have this plague on them. They're just, it's a deadly outbreak of tumors. So it had to be miserable for them. So they realized, we've got to return this Ark of the Covenant to the Israelites. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, after 7 months of this awful disease, the ark is put on, they make a new wagon for it, is drawn by 2 oxen, and they drive it out of Ekron, and they left it to go on its own. They didn't want anything to do with it. So they drove it out of Ekron toward the Israelites, and the Israelites did discover it. They were overjoyed to welcome it back, and it arrives at Beth Shemesh, which is in the center of the map. At that point, some of the Israelites, however, they disobeyed the religious laws, and they looked inside the Ark of the Covenant. And as a result of that, at Beth Shemesh, 70 men of the city die. The ark then is moved to Kirith Jearim, which is number 7 on the map. So it goes up to Kirith Jearim, to the house of Abinadab. And it stays in the house of Abinadab for 20 years until it is eventually moved to Jerusalem by King David. And that's roughly 1004 BC. The ark, again, David wanted to bring it to Jerusalem from Kirith Jearim. However, he forgot about the laws of how to transport the ark. And he and his men did not remember the instructions on carrying it with poles and only carrying it with poles. So not remembering that and thinking the easiest thing to do is to build a cart for it. They built a cart to transport the ark, and their initial attempt failed. They carried the ark, we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. They carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio were driving the cart. And David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. And when they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to take hold of the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and it struck him down, because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. So as a result of that event, Uzzah dying, touching the ark, they left the ark and kept it in the house of Obed-Edom in that area for 3 months before David decided, nothing else had happened, so he's going to try to move it again. So this time, in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, the Levites bore the ark of God on their shoulders by its poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. So, not surprising then, after this transportation was successful, there was a great celebration that followed. David at the time, he was recognizing, hey, I have this great palace. I live in a house of cedar, but the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord is living in a tent. So, in his mind, this had to change. Had to change the where this Ark of the Covenant dwelled. So when Solomon became king, this all changed. Solomon used those supplies gathered by David to build the temple. And as our lesson text reports, when we get there, we're going to read this, that then the ark was installed into the temple soon after the completion. When it was properly positioned in the most holy place and the individuals were present, they were worshiping God, the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priest could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. So now the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple, God was with the people, and another celebration would take place to mark this momentous occasion in the reign of Solomon. So let's read from our text today is 2 Chronicles chapter 5. 2 Chronicles chapter 5. I'm going to read the first 10 verses there, talking about the Levites and the ark. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. Thus all the work that Solomon did for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated and stored, the silver, the gold, and all the vessels and the treasures of the house of God. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people in Israel in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled before the king at the feast, that is, in the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites took up the ark. And they brought up the ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The Levitical priests brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And they are there to this day. There is nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So, following this completion of the temple, it remained this magnificent structure. It needed to be furnished. So, Solomon brought in the ark to place it, and as well as a lot of the gold and the furnishings to furnish the house. Having done so, Solomon then called for the people to bring the ark, to do this on a specific day. This was the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. So this Feast of Tabernacles was especially meaningful because this was a celebration to recall God's care for them while they were living in temporary booths as they were wandering in the wilderness. So during that time, God inhabited the temporary place in the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant resided as they were traveling in the tent, in the tabernacle, and all this was done according to God's will and instruction. But everything was changing now. The ark, where the Lord had met with his people, it was moving to a more permanent location or a more permanent structure. But God never forgot his people, and they had not forgotten him. So obeying the laws of Moses, the Levites took up the ark. They brought up the ark to the tabernacle of meeting, so they also brought the tabernacle as they came with them, and all the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. And while this was happening, while they were bringing all this up, Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him before the ark were sacrificing sheep, oxen. There's so many that couldn't be counted or numbered. Because they were sacrificing and giving thanks to the Lord and praising the Lord for his kindness. And it was more than symbolic bringing all these things to the temple. The people, led by King Solomon, they were worshiping, they were celebrating this occasion, and the ark was taken into this inner sanctuary, a most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. And we see in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 3, the author of Hebrews called this part of the temple the Holy of Holies. And it described how the cherubim of glory were overshadowing the mercy seat. The ark contained the 2 tablets, or the 10 commandments, the 2 tablets of Moses that he got from Sinai. And when the Lord made commandments and a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. So the event was as magnificent as the new temple. This is a great celebration that they're moving the things into the temple, including the Ark of the Covenant. Let's read then chapter 5, 2 Chronicles, verses 11. We're going to go all the way through chapter 6, verse 2. And when the priests came out of the holy place, for all the priests who were present had consecrated themselves without regard to their divisions, and all the Levitical singers, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, their sons and kinsmen, arrayed in fine linen with cymbals, harps, and lyres, stood east of the altar with 120 priests who were trumpeters. And it was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to make themselves heard in unison, in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The whole house, they were chanting this and singing this phrase, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. So that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. Then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness, but I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. So after then the ark came into the... Yes? I'm sorry, hold on just a second, I can't hear.
I said, I'm not a student of modern Judaism or Jerusalem. I was just wondering, does anyone know what happened to the ark? And is the temple
Okay. Okay, I will try. I know a little bit about what you're asking. I'm not definitively, but I tried to read a lot about what is currently going on. So the first question is, whatever became of the ark, right? Where is the ark now? Right, it was very significant. Hmm. Right. Well, I can tell you what I found out in reading. So, right now, the ark is in Solomon's temple. They're just installing it now. It remained in Solomon's temple throughout the history of the kings of Israel and Judah for the next 300 years. So, it stayed in the temple for the next 300 years. Sorry, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. No, it's good. Those are good points, and I was going to try to hit on that if we had time, but this is a good questions. Okay, I'm going to have to struggle without my glasses. Okay, so it stayed in the temple for 300 years. There was, except for one incident during that time, that there was an evil king Manasseh. He removed the ark, and which testified against him and placed an idol there instead. And that was in 2 Chronicles 33. So he removed the ark, put an idol in the temple. But later, Josiah restored the Ark of the Covenant to the Holy of Holies. The Bible records that Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon were destroyed in 586 BC. But there's no record in the Bible of what happened to the Ark at that time. But when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed, he was from Babylon. He destroyed Jerusalem, the temple. There's no mention of the ark in those passages, and it was not mentioned among those spoils that he took with him back to Babylon in the Bible. As we look at additional biblical counts, there is no mention of the ark when the objects were returned by King Cyrus of Persia. When they came back, he returned items that had been captured. This was in the book of Ezra. And there's no mention of the ark in the prophetic writings of Jeremiah and Ezekiel of the arks where the ark was. And there's no mention of the ark when Alexander the Great came and made sacrifice. When he came to Jerusalem, there's no reference to the Ark of the Covenant. Among those spoils of Antiochus Epiphanes, who plundered in the second temple that had been rebuilt at that time, he plundered it, and there is an apocryphal book that we considered uninspired that is between the Old and New Testaments that talks about the Ark of our Covenant is spoiled. But it's interesting that in the Apocrypha, although we consider it uninspired, it does mention that the Ark of the Covenant, it could not be found when the temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt. This second temple, the second temple of Zerubbabel, had come back and rebuilt it. This would have been during the time of Ezra and Zechariah, so there was nothing mentioned there. It could not be found at that point. And the reason this particular book gives in the Apocrypha that's uninspired was that at the time Jeremiah removed the Ark of the Covenant prior to, and he hid it in Mount Nebo area before those Babylonians came and wiped out the temple. But that is all speculation. It's uninspired from the Apocrypha. But that really is we don't know anything else beyond those things when after the destruction in 586 BC. It just was not mentioned again.
You know, in Daniel chapter 5, I think it is, where he gives Nebuchadnezzar
Mhm. Mhm. Right. So definitely we know about that vessels were taken. They're mentioned. They're mentioned as being in Babylon, as you mentioned, in their celebration. But we also know a lot of them were returned by King Cyrus when they rebuilt the temple the second time. But the ark was not among those things that were mentioned. But the smaller things, the vessels and things were mentioned as having been returned. Um, the temple was rebuilt. It was not to the glory when they came back from being in captivity. And you talk about the first temple destroyed, the second temple was rebuilt. And then through the years, there's also, I'm sorry, I get some of these timelines mixed up. There's also the temple of Herod, where Herod had renovated the temple. And there are several references to temple. Was it the Herod's temple that we read about in the New Testament at that time? So when we read about the temple in the New Testament, it was Herod's temple that he had renovated and rebuilt. I don't have this piece, but I think it was AD 70 when the Romans came in. They totally wiped out the temple. The only thing remaining today is I'm not sure this map is going to show us. The temple was totally destroyed by the Romans. When we think of today what the remnant is left, we hear about the West Wall or the Wailing Wall where the Jews come. That particular wall is a remnant of the reinforced support wall of the outer. Because this is on such a hill and a mountain, they had to do a lot of work for retaining and retention. So that particular wall was part of Herod's temples, from what I read, as far as a retaining wall. It was not actually a wall of the temple itself, but it was what was left as a retention wall that they can still come and say their prayers and treat it as holy. So that's what. Somebody else may be speak as far as modern times. Do the Jews have a Holy of Holies? Or I don't think they do. But I can't speak to what they're sacrificing and their, what they do today, as far as their ceremonies and all those things. Can anybody speak more to that? Yes, Johnny.
I don't think they have an area that would be reflective of the holies of holies. As far as sacrifices, the last group of Jews that I was aware of stopped sacrificing probably 2-3 decades ago. So they no longer engage in animal sacrifices. I did hear somebody say, or at least I read, I think, that instead of sacrificing a lamb during the Passover, they would bring out the bones of the lamb as sort of a symbolic Passover.
Okay.
But now from what I gather, when the temple was destroyed, all the records of the genealogies of the Levitical priesthood and Aaron were destroyed, and so they had no real concrete way of determining who was a priest and who was not.
Okay. So with the destruction of the temple, a lot of those genealogies that traced lineage to the Levitical priesthood were destroyed, so they didn't really have any good way to determine who valid priests were anymore. Brother Johnny said he didn't know of anything today that would mirror the temple setup. He thought maybe it's been 2 or 3 decades was the last time that he had heard of actual doing the animal sacrifices in true form, but they do have some kind of, he said, some kind of symbolic ceremony to depict that. So I'm sorry I can't answer more about that, but it was, at this time, it was what God had commanded. And of course, this is Old Testament law. This is how God interacted with his people when, on the Day of Atonement, he met with the high priest one day a year and came into the Holy of Holies. And the high priest would sprinkle the mercy seat with blood of the Lamb for the forgiveness of sins, to roll those forgiveness of sins of Israel forward this one day a year. And at that point also, they would sprinkle, you might know the term scapegoat. They would offer and sacrifice one goat, and then have a scapegoat with which they sprinkled blood to and then let that goat go into the wilderness, symbolically saying, okay, we're going to carry the sins of the people of Israel away. We're going to set this goat free, and the goat's going to carry the sins away. So that was a very important time, important day, but also the date that they are bringing the ark in was the Feast of Tabernacles, which reflected back to when they were wandering in the wilderness and the mercy that God had showed them while they were living in temporary tents. You asked something else, I think. I don't think I hit all of it, did I? Okay. Right. So talking about the remnant, God keeping a remnant of his people, we see in the Old Testament the physical Israel that this is a part of, but going into the New Testament and the new law, Paul is making a comparison of spiritual Israel, how God has kept not just the lineage of the Israelites and of David here, but because Christ fulfilled this lineage and fulfilled the law, God is faithful to preserve his promises and keep the spiritual Israel, which is the church now, to be faithful. But this is shifting during this time from the physical Israel that we're reading about in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament it talks about spiritual Israel. We're making the change then. We're God's people in spiritual Israel, and God is watching over us and protecting us, not because of we're Jews or because of our physical lineage, but because we have put on Christ and we are His people through baptism, and that's the spiritual Israel that we see so much in the New Testament. Let me hit one or two things here, and I think we covered a lot of the ground just in discussion. If you'll give me just a moment. In 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 3 through 11, Solomon, after this big celebration, Solomon is coming out, he's speaking to the people, and he began again by praising God for keeping his promise to David. God had promised David that he had selected Jerusalem for the place for the temple. God promised that David was going to be to lead his people. And he was praising God for all these things coming to pass and for being true to his people. And Solomon then was doing what David could not do. He was fulfilling God's promise that David's son would be building the temple. And the temple then, it was constructed to God's glory, not to man's glory. And we read that in description of the ark, and it's all this celebration, standing in awe of God, is something that we need to be carrying over. Is we see in this text that in all these things that the Bible and this story, it never loses sight of God's role in bringing these events to pass. So God delivered his people from Egyptian bondage. God promised David that his son would build the temple. God filled the temple with his glory and this cloud in response to the people's praise and thanksgiving. So God is with his people in a special way, and his presence is undeniable. And while today we don't necessarily have that physical words lost me. It's not ramification. Physical manifestation of God in our presence. We still know through faith he is with us, and he's with us as his people. So thank you all. Great conversation. Thank you for your questions and your comments. I really appreciate it. We'll move on to something a little different next week. So appreciate everybody paying attention. Thank you.